Mr. C has a head injury, and he's admitted to the neurointensive care unit. He's intubated. In the first few days, his blood pressure is low, his intracranial pressure is high. And in this situation, it's hard to prioritize nutrition. And as a result, in the first 3 days, he's accumulated a 4,000 calorie deficit. So the team starts tube feeds for him, and he stabilizes. But then he has a procedure, and he has to fast for this procedure, and he loses calories on day 5. And over the next few days, he has to fast again before he's extubated. By the time he leaves the unit, he's accumulated a 10,000 calorie deficit, and that's the equivalent of any of us fasting for 5 days straight. And now he faces a difficult course of rehab ahead of him. This is a problem that happens nationwide, and in our ICUs in particular, we measure that 38% of patients on any given day are not receiving enough calories, and even fewer, 11%, are receiving enough protein. And this is out of 330 patients that come through a single ICU a year that depend on enteral feeds. This is a problem because inadequate feeding leads to muscle breakdown, it leads to prolonged vent dependence, and ultimately longer ICU stays. And we estimated this would cost $500,000 to $1 million a year for a single ICU. So we put together a team to try to understand this problem better. And we did a contextual inquiry. We went on rounds, we interviewed people to try to understand this problem. And we really conceptualized feeding as a tube. And along the way, there are leaks. And we identified leaks such as holding feeds for various interruptions, also when patients have to fast before procedures, and also under ordering as well. And in this process, we gained a few really important insights. So first, we realized that doctors and nurses actually have very little awareness of how well their patients are being fed. And this information is just not readily available. Number two, no one had a clear ownership of this problem. And so no one was making sure that at the end of the day, their patients had enough calories. So here's what we did. Since we recognized that no one really knew how well their patients were doing, we knew we needed a fuel gauge for nutrition. And we built what we called the virtual calorimeter. And this was connected to live EMR data, and it was constantly monitoring several metrics that were associated with feeding. And we brought this information on rounds, and we made it a topic of discussion. So we troubleshooted when there was a deficit, and we also did an educational campaign to teach providers why this is so important. Finally, in the next phase, we sent automated feedback through secure text messaging. We sent that to the bedside nurses, to the dietitians, and to the doctors in the ICU. So here's what we found. Subjectively, we had some great responses. So nurses told us that based on this feedback alone, they were able to identify barriers. And oftentimes, they said it led to a discussion to try to troubleshoot reasons for feeding. Dietitians told us that this information helped them prioritize who to see and prompted early interventions. So, as I mentioned before, we were achieving 38% of patients with adequate calories and 11 with protein. By the end, we had 57% of patients with adequate calories and 31 with adequate protein. Here's the length of stay graph. On the left, ICU length of stay decreased by 3 days. Hospital length of stay decreased by 5 days on this intervention. So we proved that we had more adequate feeding, we had shorter length of stay, and on this basis alone, we estimate that we could save 700 ICU days per year in a single ICU, and this is worth up to $2 million. If you extrapolate the data from the literature about mortality, we estimate 7 lives saved per year in a single ICU as well. But we're not done. While we have identified ways to patch up a lot of the leaks, so to say, one remains, and this is one of the sacred cows that Roy mentions. It's fasting prior to procedures. Patients, this is deeply ingrained in our culture, and patients feeds are stopped regardless of whether they're the first procedure of the day or the last procedure of the day. And in fact, if you look at any given time, a quarter of patients have their feeds held in anticipation of a procedure. And this happens in part because scheduling is imprecise, and that leaves doctors and patients in the dark about what's going to happen. This elucidates an even larger problem to us, which is that from the moment Mr. C enters the hospital, he's on somebody else's schedule, whether it's the radiologist, the consultant, or the proceduralist. So we need a paradigm shift. How can we coordinate these services around Mr. C? We plan to design a system for Mr. C, his family, his providers, to have a schedule of his day at the beginning. And that way they can better plan his needs, whether medical, social, or in this case, nutritional. So in our roadmap ahead, we plan to investigate the scheduling problem. Then we plan to investigate some nurse-driven feeding protocols. After that, we're going to reconnect to the live EPIC data and then spread to other ICUs. And we have the right team to do it. So we're doctors, nurses, we are dietitians, and we have software development expertise, design expertise, and we're always looking for innovative partners to join us on this effort. Thank you.